Hello, a very warm welcome to all of you. So today we are going to cover transitional theories of migration. Right. So just like you know, there's a theory of demographic transition, you also have theories of mobility transition, right? So the most influential work in the theories of mobility transition is that of Wilbur Zelinsky. And Zelinsky's worked on, there's a 1971 paper, and Zelinsky's largely worked on linking development with mobility patterns. And so just coming back to the theory of demographic transition, some of you may be familiar with the theory of demographic transition. And so we'll quickly kind of recap, or if this is the first time for you, I'll just take you through the theory of demographic transition so that then, then we can talk about transitional migration theories with respect to those theories. And according to the theory of demographic stage transition, the first stage is where you have high fertility and high mortality. So in other words, the birth rate is high and the death rate is also quite high. So therefore, in the first stage, population growth is low because both the birth rate and the death rate is high. Then in the second stage of the theory of demographic transition, what you have is you have a high birth rate and you have a low death rate, right? So you have high fertility but low mortality. And this is largely because of development, because of advances in medical science and so on. So we don't need to go into detail of that, but just to remember for you that in the second stage, you have a high birth rate, the birth rate continues to be high, but the death rate falls. And then you have the third stage broadly, where you have both low fertility and low mortality, or you have a low birth rate and a low death rate, right? So, I mean, that's generally the theory of demographic transition. It's used in population studies, it's used by demographers. So, the idea of transitional theories of migration also comes from this broad idea of the theory of demographic transition, right? And also, I want to remind you that how we discussed in the first class that population change can happen in any society, in any country. Population change can happen only through three ways, right? What are these three ways? Through changes in mortality, which is changes in death rate, or changes in fertility, which is changes in birth rate, or migration, right? And now because we've reached a stage more or less where on the whole we have low mortality, we have low fertility, we're pretty much in the beyond the third stage of demographic transition. So therefore migration becomes very important in understanding population changes, and that also explains why not only in the social sciences, also in demography, why migration is increasingly becoming important. Now, for any country to keep its population stable, it needs to have a replacement rate of 2.1. What do we mean by a replacement rate of 2.1? So, very simply put, it means that every woman must have 2.1 babies to keep the population stable, right? And now with this little bit of a backdrop, I'll take you through the transitional theories of migration. And in this lecture, we are largely using De Haas's work, De Haas's working paper on migration and development, which simplifies Zelinsky's theory of mobility transition, and it also makes some modifications. You know, as we've been seeing for so long that in this course that there are equilibrium models of neoclassical economics, there have been the push-pull model, and all of these look at migration as an outcome. As an outcome of what? Spatial differences between origin and destination, right? And so the idea, the idea that migration is because of wage differences, income differences between source and destination, these ideas are somewhat inconsistent with certain other ideas. And what are these ideas? Well, first that, these ideas that migrants move only when you have differences in wages, differences in income, disequilibrium. They then therefore tend to undervalue migrants' own agency, their perceptions, their aspirations. And then of course, we also find that if you look at empirical studies, you also find that a lot of theories of equilibrium, theories of push and pull are not consistent with empirical studies, because the empirical studies show much more complex patterns of migration than these theories, right. So, this is exactly where transition theories come in. And so, we want to understand how migration and the broader processes of development are reciprocally related. What is the relationship between migration and the broader processes of development? And then in turn, how is it that the character and development role of migration might change in the course of development processes, right. So, therefore, in this context, the theories of the transitional models of migration and development, their interconnections become very important, and it's therefore helpful to look at these transitional theories in migration. And like I mentioned in the previous slide, that so just like the way we have had the theory of demographic transition, what the mobility transition theory tries to do is it tries to link demographic transition theory to the patterns of population mobility. So, now we come to Zelinsky's 1971 paper, in which what Zelinsky tries to do is it links vital transition to mobility transition. Now, vital transition is nothing but a code word used by Zelinsky for development, right. And development is you can broadly understand development, and Zelinsky in his 1971 paper, he notes that the growth in individual mobility has been spectacular in modernizing society. So, there is something about modernization, there is something about development that is connected with increasing migration, right. So, what Zelinsky is really trying to do is he is trying to link this vital transition, which is development, to mobility transition, trying to understand how mobility patterns change with increasing development, right. And so, therefore, you can argue that it broadens the concept of demographic transition by linking demographic transition to processes of modernization, processes of economic growth and mobility. So, according to Zelinsky, there are 5 phases of vital transition, right. So, the first phase is the pre-modern traditional society. Now, what happens in the pre-modern traditional society? In the pre-modern traditional society, you have a high fertility rate and a high mortality rate, and therefore, you have very little natural increase of population. So, you can think of the historical evolution of societies, and in the beginning there was the pre-modern traditional society with both high fertility and high mortality rates, right. Then the second phase is the early transitional society. Now, what is the early transitional society phase characterized by? The early transitional society is characterized by a rapid decline in mortality, right. So, the death rate is rapidly declining, the birth rate stays unchanged, and so you have major population growth. The third stage is the late transitional society, and in the late transitional society, you have a major decline in fertility, that is a major decline in birth rates, right. And so, you have a significant but decelerating natural increase. The population is still increasing right now, but it is increasing at a decelerating rate. And then the fourth phase is the advanced society. What is the advanced society? In the advanced society, you have fertility and mortality, which are both stabilized at low levels. So, therefore, your birth rate is low, your death rate is low, and they are both stable at low levels, and you have a very slight population increase, if at all any. And then, of course, you have the super advanced society. In the super advanced society, you have continuing low fertility and continuing low mortality rate. So, you can actually map, it's very interesting, you can actually map countries in the world and see what stage they are at according to Zelinsky, right. And now, so what we have is, so you have these 5 phases of vital transition, after which Zelinsky links these phases of vital transition, each phase with distinct mobility patterns. So, when we try to link each phase of the vital transition or development with distinct mobility patterns, Zelinsky argues that, so in very early on, you have the pre-modern traditional society. Now, this is the pre-modern traditional society is before the onset of urbanization. You have high mobility, which is can also known as nomadism, but you have low migration, right? And then the second stage is the early transitional society. Now, when you come to the early transitional society, all forms of mobility increase. All forms of mobility increase, whether it's rural, urban, internal migration, international migration, and the early transitional society is also very commonly known for a rural exodus, a mass exodus of population from the rural areas, also rural urban migration, right? And then we have the late transitional society. Now, in the late transitional society, rural exodus decreases, right, as does international migration. So, as societies advance, rural urban migration also decreases and international migration also decreases. So, in advanced society where your population has stabilized and both fertility and mortality are quite low, there are two kinds of migration that become very important. The first is urban migration. So, a lot of migration within urban areas and between urban areas. And also circular migration becomes more important. People migrate and then come back to their place of origin, right? And it's also the time as societies become more advanced, as countries become more advanced, they become from net immigrant societies to net immigration societies. So, and you know, this is only logical, this is natural. As societies develop, the net, on the net, they have more people coming in than going out, right? And this is also a time where they have mounting unskilled and semi-skilled workers that come in from developing countries. Why is this? This is because, you know, in the labor market, there are certain kinds of jobs which people might not want to do in advanced societies. So, for that, you need a stream of migration of unskilled labor from developing countries, right? And by the time we come to super advanced society, most migration is urban, right? From one urban area to another. But this whole immigration, right? Immigration of labor continues. Why does immigration of labor continue? Because there are always some jobs in advanced societies which its natives, its citizens would not want to do, will be unwilling to do, and for these kinds of jobs you need a constant supply of international labor migrants. And so Dehas tells us that the mobility transition theory, it fits very well into broader theoretical perspectives on migration and development, right? So, and so you have improvements in transport and communication, flows of knowledge, and in the context of perceived lack of local economic opportunities, you have these mobility transition theories that work well. The other thing is that, you know, when you have growing levels of welfare, people have increased capabilities, but they also have increased aspirations, right? So, therefore, development is associated with more and not less migration. And so, therefore, as we saw in the earlier slide, migration tends to increase in the early phases of development. And development processes do not lead to a decrease in migration. They are associated with an increase in migration, right? And so this is also one of the fundamental reasons, you know, when you come to policies, very often we find that, you know, countries have had policies to reduce migration, to stop migration. And but these policies don't work, and these policies are bound to fail, because development by nature means increasing capabilities of people, increasing aspirations of people, and therefore people will migrate. So the idea that you can have mobility controls along with development is something which is not empirically valid, and when you think of it, it's not even like logically valid, right? So we also then, therefore, the idea mobility transition theory, you can see is by nature, it's profoundly rooted in the modernization theory. There are patterns, ways, phases in which societies develop. Along with that, their fertility and mortality behavior changes, and along with that, even the patterns of mobility change. So that's what mobility transition theory are saying or doing. They're showing you how patterns of mobility change with development in general. So therefore, they're very, very rooted in modernization theories and modernization ideas. The other thing is that, so one of the critiques of transitional theories also is that, you know, how is it that empirically we know all societies have not, you know, developed in the phases of vital transition that we just saw, and, you know, they're not universal. For many societies, they're ahistorical, right? These stages, they're a very Western-centered concept of development. Then if that is the case, then the question arises as to, you know, what is the validity of transitional theories then? So that's again, one of the critiques of transitional theory is that it's rooted in modernization, and so, and modernization itself can be, you know, can be questioned on empirical grounds, right? Because the global south is developed in a very different way historically than the West. And then the other issue with mobility transition theories is that there is actually fine. So the theory says that these are the patterns of demographic transition and these are the patterns of mobility transition. So that point is well taken, the idea is well taken. But what is the relationship? Is there a causal relationship between demographic transition and mobility change? That is something that this, you know, theory doesn't talk much about. And then of course, you know, there's this other very important point that comes from rural studies, comes from rural history, is that the idea that traditional societies have been largely immobile. So, you know, scholars have questioned. So scholars have questioned the idea that it was the Industrial Revolution that uprooted peasants from their stable communities for the first time. And this is considered to be, you know, a romanticized and elitist view of peasant life. Right. So, moving ahead with the transitional theories, so Dehaas takes us through, you know, the idea that the relationship, the causal relationship between demographic change and migration is indirect, and it's fundamentally non-deterministic. You cannot determine it, right? So he takes us through the example of population growth, right? And he says that, you know, it's not just because of population growth per se that people migrate or people don't migrate, right? For instance, you could have population growth that coincides with high economic growth, right? Like you see in the Gulf states, you have high rates of population growth and you have high economic growth, and so but you don't have high migration. So that's, you know, so it's not necessary that modernization and high economic growth necessarily leads to higher migration. We don't see that happening in the Gulf states, right? Similarly, you know, he takes us to the example of Eastern European countries, and so you could have stagnant populations that may still experience high rates of emigration if the economic conditions or political conditions are unfavorable, right? And this is typically in the case of post-1991, a lot of Eastern European countries saw very high rates of migration, right? And this again, you know, had little to do with population, more to do with economic and political conditions, right? So, the idea, you know, we spoke about it earlier, the idea that migration is a new phenomena is again based on the myth of the immobile peasant that that we spoke about, that historically there is an idea that before the Industrial Revolution, that rural society did not have much mobility and migration, but that has, by historians, that has been shown to be not true. And the other thing is that in Western discourses on development, there is this assumption that therefore pre-modern societies had relatively isolated peasant communities, and these peasant communities were stable, they were static, they were homogeneous. So even this assumption is not really empirically valid when you kind of scratch historical ground. We now come to Skeldon's work. So Skeldon, besides building on Zelinsky's work, so Skeldon gives us 5 development tiers. You have old and new core countries. Together they include Western Europe, North America and Japan. And so over here you have immigration and you have internal decentralization, right? So in these old core countries and the new core countries, they are characterized by immigration, people coming into these countries, migrants coming into these countries, and within the country there is a fair bit of migration which is going on in a decentralized manner. Then the second tier is that of the expanding core, right? What is the expanding core? The expanding core is Eastern China, Southern Africa and Eastern Europe. In these regions, we have both immigration and outmigration which is going on simultaneously, and we also have internal centralization, right? So largely people moving towards the centers in these countries. Then we have a fourth tier which is the labor frontier. What is the labor frontier? The labor frontier is dominated by countries largely from where there is a fair bit of outmigration, right? You have international migrants, and these countries are Morocco, Egypt, Turkey, Mexico, the Philippines, and until recently Spain and Portugal. So you know there is a stream of migration that goes from Morocco to Europe. Then you have a stream of migration going from Egypt to again to Europe, from Turkey to Germany, Mexico to the United States, from the Philippines to the United States and many other countries, right? And of course, Spain and Portugal are no longer the labor frontier. They are countries in Southern Europe that used to provide labor to other countries in Northern Europe. So the labor frontier countries are dominated by outmigration of labor, and there's also internal centralization within these countries. And then, the last tier is that of the resource niche. Sub-Saharan Africa, parts of Central Asia, Latin America, where you have variable and weaker forms of migration. So like I was mentioning earlier, what Skeldon does is, besides building on Zelinsky's work, this regionalization can also be sort of, seen as a very specific application of the center periphery models of the world systems theory of Immanuel Wallerstein, right? A very specific application, a very migration specific application of the world systems theory, where you look at the world as a whole and you look at the world as core and periphery, and you look at the relationship between the core and the periphery, between different regions of the world, and so on. We now come to the migration hump, right? So De Haas takes us through the migration hump in the paper, which is largely based on Martin and Taylor's work. So what is the idea of a migration hump, right? The idea of a migration hump is that the economic development process, what it does is, in the short to medium term, it stimulates migration, right? So while it stimulates migration, because you have these policies which are accelerating economic growth, including privatization, land reform, freer trade, all of these policies lead to an increase in migration. You have structural change going on, people are moving from agriculture to industry to services. So all of these policies lead to an increase in migration. Modernization leads to an increase in migration, which therefore produces a migration hump. Like you can see the hump in these graphs, right? There's a hump there and there are these humps here, and I'm going to come to these graphs. So what you have really is that there are several scenarios in which we can understand these humps, right? And I will take you through these graphs. So you can see very well in the first graph, you know, on the x-axis you have development, and on the y-axis you have international migration. So now if you look at this graph, as countries develop, you can see that emigration increases first, right? Out-migration increases. And then over time, it tends to decline. Now, let's take the example of India, right? In India, you know, we are in these stages where we're developing, we're still developing, we're a low and middle income country that's developing. So it's not surprising that migration is increasing, you know, international migration continues to increase. So this, you know, India fits in very well. And then as countries become more developed, out-migration, emigration, which is out-migration, migration outside the country, that falls. What's happening to immigration? Immigration refers to migrants coming into a country. So with development, we expect that countries develop, the rate of immigration increases, right? And so you can see that immigration, which means as countries develop, they also become lucrative destinations for migrants to come in, right? And much of the Western countries are there at that stage, you know. They are economically well off, per capita incomes are very high. So you have a situation where in the developed countries, immigration continues to be high, and like we saw earlier, there are certain jobs in developed countries which the native population will not be interested in doing, they do not desire to do. So there's always a supply of labor which is willing to go to developed countries, but there's a demand for that labor, right? So immigration continues to increase as countries develop, right? So now let us look at internal migration. Until so far in the graph on the left, we discussed international migration. What about internal migration? So as countries develop, right, let's look at rural-urban migration first. So you can see as countries develop, rural-urban migration first increases and then it declines, right? So you can imagine, you know, as countries develop, there is urbanization, the population moves from rural areas to urban areas, and over time much of the population shifts from the rural areas to urban areas. So then once this has happened, once this stage is complete, you can see that rural urban migration then tends to decline, right? What about circular migration? Circular migration refers to people migrating to one place and eventually coming back to the source region. So you can see that circular migration though continues to increase, right? And this too you can imagine in terms of as the country is developed, you know, over time people have strong roots, they want to go back to where they come from, they want to go back to where they belong or what they consider their homeland or their native place, and that is something that continues with development, right? So then circular migration increases and continues to increase. The third form of mobility in internal migration is urban-urban, migration between urban areas, and intra-urban, migration within an urban area. So as societies, and you can see that urban-urban migration also increases, right, along with development. And this is also very logical because as societies develop and they urbanize, then typically a majority of your population lives in the urban areas. Let's take the example of India. In India today, you know, according to the latest census results, which are old results, but the latest we have from 2011, is that 31% of our population lives in the urban areas, Now, this means that 69% of our population lives in the rural areas. So, we still have a lot of scope for rural-urban migration, and this is something I will discuss as we move along the course. But what we know that, we also know that in India, 10% of all migration is urban-urban. So, urban-urban migration is a distinct category, and you can imagine as societies develop, urban-urban and intra-urban migration tend to be very important. So, now De Haas in his paper suggests some modifications to Zielinski's model, right? What are these modifications? The first thing he says is that, okay, it's good that what Zielinski is doing is linking development with mobility transition patterns, but it should also allow, eventually transition theories should also allow for a historical regional pattern, right? Because we know that these patterns are not universal, so we need to talk about historical regional patterns. We also need to talk about time spatial pattern. Time and space are important, right? Because Western countries grew and developed in a certain way. That doesn't mean that all countries in the world today, the global south, will develop in the same way, and we kind of know that it hasn't, right? So, therefore, within a general system, we need to look at patterns by time and space, and also patterns by a historical and regional frame, right? The other thing De Haas says is that if you want a realistic perspective on transitional migration, then you need to look at the relationship between development and specific types of migration as something that's indirect, right? Okay, this is happening, but it's indirect. You cannot think or call it to be direct and deterministic, right? And and specifically, because migration studies is still a social science, migration is still a human behavior and a social behavior. So, you can have patterns, but you can't predict. You can't predict it like a law, right? And so, therefore, and within this, he comes with this, empirical. He starts with the empirics and he says, so neoclassical theory is constantly talking about disequilibrium, right? Differences in wages, differences in income, differences in potential income that explain migration. But we also, and these are all absolute, right? But we also need to look at the relative, right? So, and empirically and more realistically, it is relative deprivation and not absolute deprivation, which is a determinant of migration, right? And of course, we need to look at development and migration beyond very narrow economic and demographic variables. It's very important that we incorporate social and cultural dimensions in development, because development, after all, is an increase in people's aspirations, increase in people's capabilities to migrate, right? So, the idea that more development has to do with more migration and not less migration is fundamental to transitional theories, right? So, what do we mean by capabilities? Capabilities, the concept which is introduced by Amartya Sen, and capabilities are very closely linked with individual freedoms. And expanding capabilities then is about expanding individual freedoms, expanding substantive freedoms that people enjoy. So, what De Haas is saying is transitional models does have a capacity to link specific forms of migration with broader processes of social and economic development. And therefore, they also interpret changing migration patterns as a result of broader development processes. But then what is happening here is that they are also then ignoring the reciprocal effects of migration and development in both destination and origin. So, this then is a somewhat limitation of transitional theory, right? And so, therefore, they are really, in that sense, they are self haunted by their inability to link the causes and impact of migration in a broader theoretical perspective. So, to sum up, we have, in this lecture, we looked at the transitional theories of migration, and we began by our conversation about how transitional theories themselves are rooted, are anchored in the idea of demographic transition, And so we looked at demographic transition and mobility transition in the beginning. Then specifically looking at Zelensky's work, where in his paper he links development with migration patterns, or the vital transition, what he calls development, with mobility transition. So we spent some time doing that. And then we looked at this migration hump, the idea that with development, how migration increases and does not decrease, and how the patterns change. We spent a little bit of time doing that. And very briefly in the end, we discussed the limitations of transitional migration theories. And with that, we come to the end of this lecture. The references are largely, we followed De Haas's work on mobility transition and the migration hump, which builds on both Martin and Taylor for the migration hump in a paper, from a paper titled The Anatomy of a Migration Hump, and Zelensky's seminal work on the hypothesis of mobility transition. Thank you.